thank you for being here. It's a privilege to learn together, a spiritual practice, and I thank you for your open minds and open hearts to this story and this learning, and the example of Bonhoeffer and how his life and his theology continue to impact us today.
We're really thrilled that you have this interest in this period of history, which is very complicated and troubling. And I'm going to bring up some of the issues that with my family. I'm going to, while he's doing that, I'm going to just do a little bit of a historical background to some of the things we talked about. One of the things I didn't mention last time, so Joe is talking basically about Bonhoeffer, and I'm focusing more on the historical context around Bonhoeffer and his life. And one of the things that I mentioned last time that a few of you were surprised at was that Adolf Hitler himself was not actually a German citizen until 1932. He was raised in Austria. He went to school to study art history and become an artist, and he failed at that. And people have often wondered what might have happened had he not. But he joined the German army and as an Austrian citizen, and later became a corporal, and then later used that as a reason for why he should become a citizen. And in 1923, he did attempt a coup to try to take over the government. It was called the Munich Beer Hall Putsch. And he was sentenced to 5 years in prison. But because the courts had been kind of stacked with people that were sympathetic to the Nazi Party, he only served 9 months in prison. But that's where he wrote his great Mein Kampf. From a Nazi point of view, anyway, which was written in 2 volumes and was extremely a big popular seller after he became chancellor, but not before. So Joel will do a little more of the recap, and then we'll get us going.
Thank you, Pastor Roy, and thanks for your flexibility, everybody. So, little recap of last week, and of course, it stopped working. All right. We got it. All right. So we talked about Bonhoeffer's childhood again, and we uplifted sort of the legacy of both of his parents, a very scientific and politically involved father and a very politically involved mother, and lineage there that probably influenced him at a deep level, like their sense of civic duty and protest of regimes prior to even Bonhoeffer's life, especially in the Prussian court and nobility. And then we focused on Bonhoeffer's education, which would deeply influence who he would become. And we'll see and focus more on sort of his life as an academic today and how the rubber meets the road for how he lives his life. But not only that, we lifted up the fact that Bonhoeffer, for being such a courageous activist, he was also a generational, once in a generation academic savant, right? He studied theology at 14. He had his dissertation by 21. He writes his second dissertation to become a professor at Berlin University. I mean, just an unbelievable academic. And then we also had Pastor Roy filling in the gaps about sort of the rise of Nazi power in Germany at the time, the enactment and implementation of anti-Semitic legislation, and then, of course, the rise of Christian nationalism, the intentionality behind the German government to marry the church and the state into the German national church. But also we heard stories of some bubbling resistance, right, of clergy. Not nearly enough, but an incredible crew started to bubble, and that's where we'll get more into that today. So with that, today's overview will be sort of this resisting church. What's the theology that founds them? How did they structure themselves? What did they actually do to resist the pressures of Nazism? And we'll talk about the incredible story and account of Bonhoeffer's involvement in the plot to kill Hitler. Unbelievable story. We'll talk a little bit more about the church during World War II, and then we'll talk about the cruel and evil and tragic death of Dietrich Bonhoeffer as well. So, but picking up where we left off from last week, eventually by the 1930s, again, he's fully ordained, he's received his PhD, he's taught in the university systems, but he does take a post as pastor in London from 1933 to 1935. And I found some of his writings during his time in London, and just listen to this. Quote, Lutheran Christianity has slid away from Luther's intentions, just as Luther felt that the Roman Catholic Church had moved away from St. Peter's and Christ's. In this Lutheran drift away from gratitude for God's grace toward the ingratitude of cheap grace, the rubber and the road are strangers, and the church is out of touch with the people to whom it is supposed to minister. End quote. So Bonhoeffer is in his early development there of one of his most critical theological concepts of cheap grace versus costly grace. That distinction that he makes academically will change the course of his entire life. It'll come up later in this session, and again, it's the concept that drives his courageous resistance of Nazism. Meanwhile, he heads back to Germany in 1935, and because the German government has married itself and co-opted and hijacked German Christian church into the German National Church, they've overtaken the German seminary systems. So on the other side of that, in response to that, a resistance of pastors and clergy and theologians had decided they've got to pump out theologians and pastors in an underground seminary, opposed to this German takeover of seminaries. And so Bonhoeffer comes back to Germany to direct the Finkenwalde seminary in 1935.
Okay. I have some questions here.
Was it Hitler's book that brought him front of this whole?
The question is did Hitler's book Mein Kampf bring him to the forefront?
Oh, no.
You know, he was a part of this. He developed and with a number of other people developed the National Socialist Party. And when he was imprisoned, a number of people felt that the imprisonment itself was unjust, right? You know, those were people that supported Hitler, obviously. And so that kind of emboldened the Nazi Party to say that he'd been unjustly treated and all those sorts of things. But he wasn't really all that popular early on. His book didn't sell very well until after he became chancellor. And then it's kind of like certain books, you know, all of a sudden you go, well, what is this guy about? And he does lay out his plans for the extermination of the Jews and other things already in 1923. I think people didn't really take him very seriously. Early on, they kind of thought of him as a bit of a buffoon, a high energy kind of character, and they never thought that he'd rise to politics. And the reason he actually became chancellor was because I mentioned last time a book by a person by the name of Riebeck. It's called Takeover. If you're really interested in this book, it just came out. It's a wonderful historical study about how Hitler rose to power. And in his rise to power, we see that you know, the Nazi Party never got more than 37% of the vote, but it was enough of a vote to be able to lock up the parliament system. And what that meant was that there was a very, very unpopular Reichschancellor before him by the name of von Papen. And he was so unpopular that people feared that there might be a civil war if von Papen was left in. Von Hindenburg was the Reich president. He wanted to kind of move the country along, but there were all these candidates, and Hitler had just enough votes to be the most popular person. In order to just kind of settle the problem, Hindenburg thought that he could control Hitler, and that so he appoints him chancellor so that he doesn't really have to dissolve the parliament, because that was it was a constitutional crisis. Hitler had said that he wanted to undo democracy with democracy. You know, get enough votes, get in there, and then you can undo democracy so that he could get in as leader. When he got in, as I pointed out last time, there was a Reichstag fire. Some people think that it was started by the Nazis, others think that it was just a fire that Hitler was opportune with, and then was able to declare martial law. And once Hitler declared martial law, he never let it up. Not long after Hitler became chancellor, Hindenburg died. And when Hindenburg was an old, very old man at the time, and when Hindenburg was able to finally get, he thought he'd be able to control Hitler. He dies, and then Hitler claims the Reichs chancellorship, Reichs presidentship, and he becomes, at that point, the leader of the army. And once he's in control of the army, there was no turning back. It basically became a dictatorship and a fascist state at that time.
So we were saying that after the German takeover of the system of seminaries in Germany, the resistance has to try to create its own underground seminary. And one of those that Bonhoeffer directs is Finkenwalde Seminary in 1935. Meanwhile, systematically, because of the stuff that Bonhoeffer's starting to write, starting to lecture, starting to preach, the state is starting to get suspicious of him, and the state-run church is starting to get suspicious of him, and the walls start to close in because of the subtle and not so subtle protests that he's making about the theological takeover and the political takeover that's happening by Nazism. And one of those consequences was Bonhoeffer's right to teach at Berlin University is revoked in 1936. So again, they're systematically trying to silence voices that protest their power and their legitimacy. And meanwhile, a year later, the Finkenwalde Seminary is closed by the Gestapo, and former students and pastors are arrested. And Roy, I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit here. Why did Bonhoeffer, as this seminary was shut down in 1937, how come Bonhoeffer was able to avoid arrest at this point?
Well, we'll see in a minute that what happens is Bonhoeffer now is in kind of a very limbo situation. He's in a very dangerous situation because he's written out, he's spoken out against Hitler and done things. He happens to have a brother-in-law who works for the Abwehr, and his name is Hans von Dohnanyi. The Abwehr is the counterintelligence agency for the German people. And he gets hired into counterintelligence in the German government because of his brother-in-law. Hans von Dohnanyi also hires Karl Bonhoeffer and a man named Rudiger Schleicher, who's married to Bonhoeffer's other sister. And so these four people get into counterintelligence, and now Bonhoeffer is seen like he's part of the system. They say, oh, well, he's working, we're not going to draft him, he's working for counterintelligence. And so that's how he gets out.
Thank you. Yeah, so he avoids the draft and avoids arrest this early on because he joins counterintelligence. Thank you for that. Meanwhile, in 1937 and 1938, Bonhoeffer pumps out two enormously impactful landmark works, right? He's an academic and a pastor and a resistor to this point, right? And his thoughts, his theological concepts are most deeply articulated to this point in his life through these landmark writings. The first in 1937, which we'll do a little bit of a deep dive into because it is so impactful for who he is and what he does. The landmark book is The Cost of Discipleship, and he starts to formulate this distinction that he was starting to talk about early on in London. Cheap grace versus costly grace, that theological distinction. And what he's basically saying by making that distinction is that Christianity is not just a private spirituality, but it is lived outwardly in meaningful sacrifice and service. Christian spirituality cannot just be something that is private to us. And so he writes this book, The Cost of Discipleship, and we'll get into kind of like a most famous couple of paragraphs here in a moment. But he also writes in 1938, Life Together. And if you remember, his dissertation was written on the communion of saints. Also similar in that dissertation is he's talking about Christianity can't just be individualistic. It can't just be about identity. It can't just be about a national identity. It has to be about community. It's lived most maturely in community. And so he writes that dissertation right at 21. And that academic theological concept takes on full flesh when he starts when he directs the Finkenwalde Seminary. And he writes an account of community life together at the Finkenwalde Seminary in this book, Life Together. Fascinating. A fascinating book on theology of community, but also just practice of being a underground community, spiritual practice, etc., and how life is lived together. Now, a little bit of a deep dive into the cost of discipleship, because again, the things he starts to say here are in some ways haunting. Dramatic irony, because we know what happens to Bonhoeffer. When he talks about the difference between cheap grace and costly grace, he says such grace is costly because it calls us to follow Jesus. We have to sacrifice part of ourselves to follow into discipleship. But it is still grace because it calls us to follow Jesus Christ, the one that we need to follow. And he goes on, it's costly because it costs a man his life. And he meant that in more ways than one, but the haunting dramatic irony in writing that line in 1937. It's costly because it costs a man his life, but it's grace because it gives a man the only true life, the most meaningful life of service and love and compassion and sacrifice. Cheap grace, though, is grace without discipleship. That's the religion that we just practice in private. We just do maybe the rituals and we go back into our own life, right? It's religion in a phone booth. We receive the grace and then we just go on about our own personal lives and individual lives. That, he says, is grace without discipleship. What Bonhoeffer is doing is he's calling us beyond what I call bumper sticker Christianity. And I don't mean to be insensitive to those of you who have bumper stickers or faith decor. I mean that, okay? It's okay, I promise. Just don't stop there, okay? That's Bonhoeffer's beckoning. Don't stop in just branding yourself and expressing yourself as Christian. For Bonhoeffer, Christianity is beyond spiritual nationalistic identity. It's beyond cheap grace. It's beyond just being a part of the brand of Christianity. It has to be lived outwardly. And one of my favorite philosophers and theologians who's living today, his name is Peter Rollins, Northern Irish existential philosopher, deeply influenced by Bonhoeffer. And Peter Rollins says this, but it's again, this is based on cost of discipleship, basically in Bonhoeffer's life. Rollins says, Christianity is not just a way of believing and thinking. It is a way of being in the world. Or as I sometimes tell our First Lutheran Church confirmands, what you are a part of, right in this moment and hopefully the rest of your lives, is not just an after-school or fan club where you get to slap on a bumper sticker on your car or a Bible quote on your social media. That's not the fulfillment and total maturation of Christianity, but rather Jesus calls us to love the neighbor in every function and sphere of our lives. The Christian, in other words, my friends, to use a Teddy Roosevelt quote, is called into the arena. Called into the arena. We are not just Christians on Sunday or Wednesday nights, right? And Rollins makes this beautiful quote, or has this beautiful summary of the cost of discipleship. For Bonhoeffer, says Rollins, faith is not concerned with believing certain things about the world, as much as it is a form of being in the world. Faith is a defiant, countercultural affirmation of existence that stands against all forms of oppression in its joyful affirmation of life. As Christians, we have joyful affirmation of life, and we are called to stand between threats to that and our neighbor who might suffer or who is suffering. That is the cost of discipleship. So Bonhoeffer also famously writes in The Cost of Discipleship, Christianity without discipleship is always Christianity without Christ. Moving along, Bonhoeffer, prolific writer, and one of the reasons we still have a lot of his writings today is because of a dear friend and former student of his, Eberhard Bethge, who we'll explore a little bit more of that relationship later, but I want to get it on your radar now that Eberhard Bethge is one of the main reasons that we have preserved writings of Bonhoeffer beyond his death. They were dear friends. They exchanged correspondences even while he was in prison, I believe. Mm-hmm. So a key and critical figure in Bonhoeffer's life. And with that, I turn it over to Roy.
I'm having trouble. Should I take that?
Thank you. Yeah, there you go.
Having trouble with this mic, so I'm going to try it this way. So, when Joe was talking about Bonhoeffer went to London, and he was there for a few years. In the meantime, what happens is there's things going on in the church that are really a problem. And the Nazi nationalist Christian, the German nationalist Christians, Christian nationalists have taken over the church. And there's a man by the name of Martin Niemöller who, in order to deal with the crisis, there were about 17,000 pastors in Germany at the time, and about 3,000 of them resisted. I'm popping all over the place, right? I'm like, oh. And maybe if I go over here. And there's about 3,000 that resisted. Martin Niemöller formed what's called the Pastor Emergency League to try to get these pastors who were resisting the Nazification of the church at the time. And after the war, Niemöller has this very, very famous quote. He says, "First they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not Jewish. They came for the communists, and I did not speak out because I was not communist. They came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. And then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak out for me." Niemöller, after the war was over, helped the church. Let's see if I can get this to work.
Make sure I didn't turn it off. I did.
Okay, no worries. After the church wrote what was called the Stuttgart Declaration, Vod Yashem is an organization in the Jewish community. You see it involved a lot in Holocaust museums. If you've been to the Holocaust Museum, they lift up righteous Gentiles, righteous people who have helped Jews and people that are persecuted throughout time. Bonhoeffer and Niemöller are not a part of that. And the reason they aren't is because early on, Niemöller was a World War I U-boat captain and a hero of the war of World War I. And he became a pastor. He met with Hitler when Hitler got into power, and Hitler assured him that he would not develop any pogroms for the Jews. He also assured Niemöller that the church would have its own autonomy and all those sorts of things. And soon Niemöller realized that he'd been lied to. But early on, he supported Hitler, as did many in the church. But once things started becoming obvious, and Hitler started doing what he mentioned in his book, Mein Kampf, the churches started to form their own group, and they will call themselves the Confessing Church. I want to show you the Stuttgart Declaration that Niemöller wrote afterwards, after the war. He says, "Through us infinite wrong was brought over many peoples and countries. That which we often testified to in our communities, we express now in the name of the whole church. We did fight for long years in the name of Jesus Christ against the mentality that found its awful expression in the National Socialist regime of violence, but we accuse ourselves for not standing to our beliefs more courageously, for not praying more faithfully, and for not being more believing more joyously, and for not loving more ardently." In other words, Niemöller and others who were a part of the Confessing Church realized that they did not stand up soon enough, long enough, or strong enough in their resistance. And just to give you an idea of what was going on in Germany at this time, this is a painting by Hoyer in 1937. The title of it is called "In the Beginning Was the Word." And it's a picture of Hitler with a swastika behind him, SS soldier. Notice that two people that are highlighted with the light are two women. And they're looking at Hitler as he's talking, and everybody in the room is very pensive and thinking about what Hitler is, and the idea that his word is bringing about this Third Reich that will last for 1,000 years. And what was his word? Social Darwinism. Some races are better than others. The Aryan race is the highest. The Jews are inferior. They are literally vermin. Use that term. And used all sorts of opportunities to disgrace the Jews and others. Hitler refused to shake Jesse Owens' hand in the 1936 Olympics, as you will remember. And the reason he did, it was a quote, he said, "I don't know why the Americans are allowing people like that, Africans, to win their medals for them." By the way, Germany won the 1936 Olympics handily, proving to Hitler and his idea that they were the superior race. This is the flag of the German Christian Church from 1932 1945. You can see DC means Deutsche Christen, German Christians, and that the swastika is placed over the top of the cross. I was talking with Joe saying that it's hard for us to imagine that we can't get past the horrors of World War II. We see the swastika and we realize it's a symbol of horror, right? At that time, they didn't see it that way. And this symbol is particularly insidious because it's a cross with a crown of thorns, but you can see a swastika tied into the crown of thorns as well. So these sorts of images were German Christian images. And Niemöller, after he forms the Pastor Emergency League, then works to develop what is called the Confessing Church. And on November 10th, which is Martin Luther's birthday, the founder of the Lutheran Church, in 1933, the German Christians celebrated Luther Day, which they did. It was a high holiday in Nazi Germany. They celebrated Luther in part because of his anti-Jewish writings. And that was something that was important to them. They lifted up Hitler's writings, especially his one writing on the Jews and their lies written in his life, which advocated such programs against the Jews. You can see early on there was sometimes outside of the churches, there were the Deutsche Christen, the German Christians, the people promoting Nazi ideology, and then the others, the evangelicals, the Confessing Church on the right, campaigning in 1933 against each other. So eventually, Bonhoeffer is in London, but a rest of these group, about 3,000 want to resist Hitler, develop what we call the Barmen Declaration, and the symbol that they developed was kind of crossing out the swastika and lifting up the suffering cross, the burning cross. And back in 1981, I was in seminary. I know it's hard to believe, but yeah, a long time ago. And Arthur Cochran, who wrote this book, was one of my professors. He was well into his 80s. He lived through Nazi Germany. He was there studying as a theologian, as a theological student, and he watched the rise of Nazism. And he's written the definitive book on the Barmen Declaration called The Church's Confession Under Hitler. And I did an independent study with him, and that started my interest in learning about the Christians in Nazi Germany, because my parents had grown up there from 1940 to 1945. And I always wanted to figure out, well, what happened? How did the church support Hitler? How did these things come about? And I used to go to Arthur Cochran's house. He wasn't a very handy man, and I'm the only person that was less handy than he was, but I would go over and I would help him, fix his yard or do things so I could just talk to him. He was a really wonderful man. And one of the things that he points out, the Barmen Declaration was this statement of the Confessing Church standing against the Nazi Church. It was written basically by Karl Barth, who had been exiled into Switzerland. And when asked about the Barmen Declaration later, at the end of his life, he said, why was it necessary? And he said, I say the answer lies simply in the naming of one name, Adolf Hitler. So I want to come back to that in a minute. So the Barmen Declaration, these 3,000 pastors got together, and I want you to notice what's missing. Because I'm going to tell you the 6 points on the Barmen Declaration, but think about what's missing in this. The church got together and they said, and by the way, a few weeks ago was the 90th anniversary of the Barmen Declaration. It was just in March when it was written. It goes, the first point is that the Word of God is divine revelation, and that the church should not be co-opted by the culture. First point. And so the church clings to the Word of God, which means Jesus and the Scriptures. Mm-hmm. Secondly, that Christ calls us to a life of discipleship and not a life of service to a political party. The church should not, I wrote this out quickly, should not follow political convictions or be forced to follow political convictions. The church is not ruled by the Führer or political leaders, but the people in the church are free to serve God in whatever way they please and according to their conscience. The church and state must be separated. This was an important doctrine of Luther's ideas, what he called the doctrine of two kingdoms, and that the church is under the word and spirit of God and not of the state. Does anybody notice what's missing in that declaration? What's that? Concern for others, and no mention of the Jews. And part of that was debated. They wanted to add lines. Barth wanted to add some lines about standing with the Jews, standing with homosexuals, standing with people who were outside of the system who were being persecuted. And everybody thought that was too radical. Bonhoeffer almost did not sign the Barmen Declaration because of that. He wasn't even there, but he didn't want to sign it because he said it doesn't go far enough. He eventually signed it because he thought, well, it's as good as I'm going to get, I'll sign that. But he really, really wanted to go farther. In today, there's a really interesting, one of the things that Joe and I thought we'd really need to bring up is there's been an interesting movement about over Bonhoeffer, and there's basically been a battle amongst scholars and religious figures in the United States especially, but around the world, who have tried to co-opt Bonhoeffer's ideas. One of them is Eric Metaxas. Eric Metaxas wrote a #1 best-selling book on Bonhoeffer's life. And basically what he's trying to do in this book is to make Bonhoeffer into somebody he's not. He's basically arguing that Bonhoeffer is a nationalist Christian, which is not what Bonhoeffer would do. And I studied Bonhoeffer for 30 years, taught Bonhoeffer for 30 years, and I read Metaxas's books, and I was really kind of surprised and horrified that it was being so popular. And Stephen Haynes is a very, very good scholar. He's a conservative scholar. He's an evangelical scholar. And he takes on Metaxas and others. It's called Debating Discipleship in the Age of Trump. And it's called The Battle for Bonhoeffer. It's very well done. And I highly recommend this book to anybody that's interested in a deeper dive into that. Because there is a debate now about some people picking up the Barmen Declaration and using it in two different ways. And there are those that are speaking that some are using it to say it promotes nationalist Christianity, which of course it doesn't. Bonhoeffer called patriotism polluted love. Bonhoeffer's idea was that it was okay to be a patriot, but it easily gets shifted into a way in which a society uses it to make the church do things that it doesn't want to do or shouldn't do, and that is stand with the Jews and the oppressed and the persecuted. Silence in the face of evil is itself evil. God will not hold us guiltless. Not to speak is to speak. Not to act is to act. If you do a word search on Bonhoeffer in Google, you'll find this is one of his most popular quotes. It's not a direct quote from him, but it's kind of a culmination of the quotes, and it's used by others.
So just picking up with the timeline and other things that are happening in and around Bonhoeffer's life, we get to around the year 1938, and his twin sister Sabina and his Jewish brother-in-law Gerhard flee to the UK. So things are heating up more and more and more, and the walls continue to close in on Bonhoeffer and his family. And then violent rhetoric starts to turn into actual violence in the streets, right? And one of the more tragic things leading up to the peak parts of this conflict was something called Kristallnacht, which is German for the Night of the Broken Glass. And what happened, incidentally, on Luther Day for the Germans in 1938 is roughly 7,500 Jewish businesses were broken into and looted. And not only that, around 300 Jewish synagogues were burned. And I was actually going through this slideshow yesterday with my son, Jefferson, because I was on the couch kind of editing things. And he goes, "What is all this?" And I told him, I said, we have Jewish family. And I said, you know, Jonathan and Michael, they go to synagogue. Jewish synagogues were burned. And I told him a little bit of the story. And I said, imagine First Lutheran Church on fire. Imagine this place on fire because we weren't allowed to be. And again, tragically, something that we Lutherans have to own and call deplorable is the fact that our lineage, which we are proud of in many respects, is also connected to some of the more vile words ever written. Luther wrote two critical pieces on the Jewish people. And early on in his life, he wanted to defend the Jewish religion and the Jewish people, and he wrote something called Jesus Was a Jew or Jesus the Jew?
Jesus the Jew.
Jesus the Jew. And sadly, later on in his life, for reasons that are barbaric nonetheless, he writes on the Jews and their lies and calls for really grotesque violence against the Jewish people. And there's a handful of reasons that scholars speculate or know or see documented as to why he wrote this. Probably the consensus being he wrote this because he was so burned by them immaturely, to say the least, that they weren't converting to Christianity. And not only that, that some of them that had converted to Christianity were converting back to Judaism, and it just set them off. Some scholars will want to save Luther, and they point to things that may or may not be true. I think there might be some evidence, but they want to save Luther on this, and they say, you know, he was senile in his old age, and he had a kidney condition that we know medically can mess with the mind. And that may be true, but he wrote it, and it led to devastating violence in his day. And again, the Nazis were using it to found their anti-Semitic efforts and enter into the streets with mob violence on Kristallnacht.
One of the questions is how did the United States or how did England respond? There was some sympathy. You must save the lives of the Jewish people in Germany. Sign a petition. Not that would have done a whole lot. It's interesting. There were Nazi rallies in the United States. I had a slide which we eventually took out, which was about a support for the Nazi Germany. This was in the 1930s. Until the war started, there was a lot of support because there was lots of Germans in the United States for even for Nazi sympathies that were even here, and we forget that. And that came up in it's one of those things that we forget. Jews asked for asylum in the United States. An entire boat, in one instance, an entire boat of Jews came to the United States, and the U.S. refused them entry, sent them back to Germany, and most of them went to concentration camps and died. So we did accept some, but we didn't accept all, and a lot of people did that around the world. Bonhoeffer was an ardent pacifist. He was really interested in pacifism. This is going to bring up some other issues in a minute. We've just recently found a letter that Bonhoeffer wrote to Gandhi. He was going to go visit Gandhi, but he was derailed from doing that in part because he found out that he was going to head the seminary at Finkenwalde, so he knew he didn't have time to go visit Gandhi and then come back. So, and unfortunately, he never met him. Other people did go. This is Charlie Chaplin visiting Gandhi in 1931. And you say, well, why is Chaplin so interesting and so important? Chaplin was born 4 days before Adolf Hitler. And when Hitler was taking over, he made an offhand comment one day. Somebody said, this guy's dangerous. And he said, why? I look just like Charlie Chaplin. They were exactly the same age. And Chaplin said, oh, you're going to use me? Okay, I'll use you. In 1938, he wrote a movie called The Great Dictator, starring his wife, Paulette Goddard, and decided to try to make fun of Hitler. This is before the war started. He couldn't find anybody to make the film because people were afraid that that he would make Hitler mad, and Chaplin said, "That's the point. I want to make him mad, and I also want to expose to the world his hatred because people are uncertain about him. I want to show this. And so he made this amazing film. And we've talked about this. Maybe some night, if you're interested, I'll show this film. I used to teach a class on Charlie Chaplin, and this film is specifically, and because of my interest in World War II. And Chaplin made the film. We know that Hitler saw it and had it in his own private library, despite the fact that he banned the movie in Germany. And he thought it was very funny, which is kind of funny in its own right. But in any case, let's see, I think I'm still, but what I want to point out is that that movie was made just as the war was coming out. Chaplin said later after the war, he said, had I known the atrocities that were being perpetrated on the Jewish people, I would have never I couldn't have taken it that, made that much fun of Hitler. Chaplin was himself Episcopalian, but after Hitler accused him of being Jewish, and a lot of people after the journalist asked him, "Are you Jewish?" And he said, "I don't have that honor." That was his response. I don't have that honor. Auschwitz was founded in 1941, and we have concentration camps being set up as early as 1933. But by 1941, we know that the final solution is being set up. At what point do you come back in? I forgot what's
Oh, I think I have to leave in about 2 minutes.
Okay, I think because of we have a wonderful clip, but we'll just tell you about that film, and maybe I'll just kind of keep cruising. And
that sounds good.
Oh, that's all right. Thanks, Pastor Joe. Appreciate it.
Hey, thank you. All right, we're gonna go baptize some kids, so I gotta meet with the family. But thank you all for coming. Thanks for sticking it out today, and thanks, Pastor Roy.
Bonhoeffer's friends, things are getting difficult, and even though Bonhoeffer is in the Abwehr, they're a little bit worried for his life. They think that he might he's going to run into trouble. Knowing Bonhoeffer, he was not going to hide his views, but he was also pretty outspoken, even though he was in the Abwehr. His friends sent him to Union Theological Seminary. Remember, he was there before. He met Franklin Fisher, and he meets John Lasserre, and learns about blacks suffering in the United States. By the way, Bonhoeffer said blacks seemed to have it worse than the Jews in Germany when he was here. He goes there, but he's there only for 2 weeks. And then he decides, if I don't go back to Germany, I can't help rebuild the church afterwards if I don't suffer with the church during the time there. He thought he was escaping, and he felt terrible about it. He got on the very last boat that made it across the Atlantic going to Germany. After that, the sea lanes were shut down because of the war and the difficulty. So he goes back, and he's working with a guy named Wilhelm Canaris, who's the head of the Abwehr of counterintelligence. And it's interesting, Canaris all of a sudden gets involved in a plot to decide to kill Hitler. And this gets pretty interesting because I said Hans von Dohnanyi works for Canaris. That's his brother-in-law. He's married to Dietrich's sister. And his brother and his other brother-in-law get involved in this plot. Bonhoeffer is barred from speaking publicly at this time. And he makes this really famous quote. If you're wondering about which biographies to read, I really like Renato Wind, Dietrich Bonhoeffer. It's called The Spoke and the Wheel. And this quote is going to explain that. It's nice and brief, and it's the one I use with my students. If you want to read Eberhard Bethge's 800-page tome, that's the most thorough. But Bonhoeffer said, now remember, he's an ardent pacifist. He wants to meet Gandhi. He wants to use passive resistance. He's, by the way, Martin Luther King Jr. did his doctoral dissertation largely based on Bonhoeffer. And he was interested in Bonhoeffer because of Bonhoeffer's pacifism. And so Dr. King used that in his own work. And all of a sudden, Bonhoeffer comes back, and he's sitting around, and he goes, oh my goodness. He says, how much can I sit around? He says, if I sit next to a madman in a car as he's driving down the street, as he drives a car into a group of innocent bystanders, I can't, as a Christian, simply wait for the catastrophe and then comfort those who are wounded and bury the dead. So in other words, he said, imagine this, if I'm in a car and I'm driving along and this guy starts mowing people down, do I just say, oh, well, I'll take care of those people later, and then not just sit there and watch that happen? I must try to wrestle the steering wheel out of the hands of the driver. Now the question is what does he mean by wrestling the hands out of or put a spoke in the wheel? I have to wrestle the steering wheel away from him. So his idea was he found out about the plot against Hitler, and then Hans von Anani asked him to be a double agent. Bonhoeffer had been working in the early ecumenical movements that came out, churches working together around the world, trying to deal with major problems and issues. By the way, the World Council of Churches has taken that sort of role up. And by the way, Martin Niemöller was the head of the World Council of Churches later. But in any case, Bonhoeffer says that he's going to be a double agent, because now, as a part of the Abwehr, he learns that people are being deported and killed. The United States learns this in 1942. It's on the timeline. If you look at 1942, Roosevelt is praised of the fact that there are these concentration camps going on at that time. Bonhoeffer hears about it a little bit earlier, and he says, okay, we've got to do something. So these deportations are starting to take place. There are about 9.5 million Jews in Europe at this time, and about 6 million of them will die in the concentration camps. And they will be exported all the way from Italy, from Hungary. About 500,000 from Hungary would die. There's about 500,000 Jews in Germany. It was about 60% of the world's population of Jews is that 9.5 million. And about 70% of those died in concentration camps. So Bonhoeffer decides, okay, I've got to figure out how to do this. He kind of becomes the spiritual leader of the people in the Abwehr. They're trying to figure out, can we justify as Christians assassinating somebody, being a part of an assassination plot? He writes this very influential book. It's his most influential book, which he never finished, by the way. He goes to a monastery, a Benedictine monastery just outside Oberammergau in Germany, and he writes this, but it was forbidden to be printed, so it doesn't get published until later, until Eberhard Gaedke uses notes and things to finish off the book, and it's after the war. So he works as a double agent, and he goes around the world talking with leaders. And he meets this bishop who later will become the Archbishop of Canterbury. He'll become one of the most important people, leaders. As the Archbishop of Canterbury, he becomes a part of the House of Lords. And Bonhoeffer would go to him and tell him, we're going to try to kill Hitler, and we're going to try to take over the government. And we want the Brits and the Allies to know this, so that they just won't indiscriminately bomb Germany once this happens. But the Brits didn't listen to him. George Bell was his name. And Bell was unable to get things done. Well, the deportations continue. Millions of Jews are dying in the concentration camps. And oddly enough, Bonhoeffer, when he was in the seminary, would tell his seminarians, I don't think this is a good time to get married. I don't think this is a good time to get involved in relationships. We've got a rough road ahead of us. And by this time, by about in the 1940s, when the war has started, many of his students have been arrested. Many of the pastors of the confessing church, about 800 of them, are arrested. There's a number of them that are still out and about. And he has known this young woman since she's about 10. Her name is Maria von Wedemeyer. Her grandmother funded the Finkenwalde Seminary. And she went to Bonhoeffer when she was about 12, when Maria was 12. And he said, would you do confirmation with her? I'd love to have you teach her. And Bonhoeffer said, well, let me sit down with her and see what she's like. He came back to the grandmother and said, she's too immature. 6 years later, he's engaged to her. Now, she's 18 and he's 36. But one of the things that's interesting is Maria is an incredibly intelligent person. And I can prove that in a minute. But she also is not only intelligent, she's vivacious, captivating, and she fell in love with Bonhoeffer, I think partially as a father figure. Her father and a brother had died recently, and she just saw in Bonhoeffer somebody who was extremely compassionate and caring, and they just fell in love. She would go on after the war to become one of the earliest scientists working in a new area called computers. And she would rise to become the highest ranking woman officer at Honeywell in the United States, and she would die tragically at the age of about 53 of cancer. Bonhoeffer would be arrested in 1943 and was taken to Tegel prison. And the reason he was arrested was, as many of you know, there's this assassination attempt, the Operation Valkyrie. And you may have seen the movies or may have heard about that. And the idea was that a guy, one of the generals, his name is Stauffenberg. How am I doing on time, by the way? I'm doing okay, a few minutes. A guy by the name of Stauffenberg has a plan to kill Hitler. He's going to go to a meeting, take a bomb, and then he pretends that he can't hear very well. He asks an aide to have him sit next to Hitler. He puts this briefcase right next to Hitler, this bomb that's supposed to go off. Right as then Stauffenberg says he has to go to the bathroom. He leaves, and right as the bomb is supposed to get up, Hitler goes and walks around the other side of the room. The bomb goes off and kills most of the people in the room, but Hitler survives. Hitler calls the assassination attempt God's justification to show that he is the chosen one. And he goes on, but now there's an attempt to find out who was behind it, and they find out that the people in the Abwehr, one note after another leads to everybody. And we were going to show this clip, but I'm just going to tell you about what happens. So Bonhoeffer is put in this prison after the assassination attempt fails in 1943. And I should say, if you want to see the excellent documentary by Doppelmayr, it's just called Bonhoeffer, and it's on YouTube. It's free, so you can see it. I highly recommend it, and especially this section on him being thrown into prison is, I'll leave this up for a sec if you want to write down his name. Doppelmayr's section on Bonhoeffer going into prison is quite moving, and that's why we wanted to show it. So Bonhoeffer is thrown into prison, and typical of Bonhoeffer, he's so compassionate, he becomes really, really close friends with the guards. And the guards are really sweet with him, and they smuggle books and letters out for him to Maria, who gets to visit him once a month, and to his friends like Eberhard Gaetke. But they also developed a system of codes, and it's very clever. Bonhoeffer would give a book to send to his family, and he would put a dot under a letter on one page, and then on the 2 pages later, he'd put another dot under another letter, and so on and so forth. If you put the letters together, it became words, and then if you read them together, they eventually became sentences, and they could communicate in code with each other. They had set this up ahead of time because they were pretty sure they were going to get caught. There's a powerful, powerful film. It's hard to watch. It's not particularly bloody or gruesome, but it's just a very difficult film. Steven Spielberg called The Zone of Interest, which was a movie up for Best Picture this year, the best Holocaust film he'd ever seen. And it's about the beginning of Auschwitz and how Auschwitz got started. I've seen the movie twice. I was so blown away by the first time. I had to watch it a second time. I reacted so emotionally to it the first time, but I highly recommend it to you. But it is a hard film to watch. Bonhoeffer is eventually, once they figure out that Bonhoeffer was really closely connected to the assassination plot, that he was trying to put a spoke in the wheel, they move him to Gestapo headquarters in Berlin, and then he's never able really to see his family or other people after that. Bonhoeffer, Hitler saw that the war was coming to an end. Hitler saw that he was losing the war. He would eventually, his girlfriend, Eva Braun, and he would commit suicide. Goebbels and his wife would commit suicide and poison their entire family, their children, in the bunker in Berlin. And others, as the war was coming to an end. But before Hitler died, he had what he called personal prisoners, and he had them all executed. Bonhoeffer, the accounts are different. They were not really sure how he died. There's a variety of them. Pretty sure that he probably was hanged, and that his body was taken and burned and buried. His ashes were scattered, so we have no idea where he's at. There's a plaque at Flossenberg, where he was killed, and there was Hans Oster, who was involved in, and Canaris, Dietrich Bonhoeffer and his brothers, and others who were involved in this whole thing. If you go to Canterbury Cathedral in London, there are these carvings on the outside, and you can see that there are various martyrs that are placed here, and Dietrich Bonhoeffer is one of them, Martin Luther King Jr. is another, and they are continuing to add to the cathedral of noted individuals who are seen as important individuals who have struggled for peace and justice in the world. And you can even see that Bonhoeffer, it's interesting, in this stained glass window, you have the noose by which he was martyred, and some other sorts of iconography. You can see like a destroyed church in the background that's burning, and Bonhoeffer's own sort of faith. Joe and I wanted to leave you with one of Bonhoeffer's writings called "Who Am I?" It was written about short months before he died, anyway. Bonhoeffer in prison was seen as a remarkable individual. You can find this poem. It's called "Who Am I?" It's online in a number of places. He was seen as a person who was compassionate. When he was brought up for trial, he didn't even offer a defense. He said, he felt with his fellow conspirators that the least, if they cut off the head of the snake, was the argument they made. If you cut off the head of the snake, they thought the Nazi movement would fall apart. And as we know, there are lots of neo-Nazis in the United States, and there are people in Germany still today, and Sweden or Norway, wherever, that still promote Nazi ideologies. And but they felt that if they could get rid of Hitler, they might be able to bring the system around. And Bonhoeffer even said to Eberhard Bethge, do you think a murderer can be forgiven? And Bethge was confused, and he said, what do you mean? He says, I'm just wondering. And so I think Bonhoeffer struggled with the idea and wondered himself whether he was, what he was doing. He knew what he was doing. He knew he'd have to confess the sin, and he knew he would have to pay for it. This is his poem. Who am I? They often tell me that I step from my prison cell poised and cheerful and sturdy, like a nobleman in a country estate. But really, who am I? They often tell me that I would speak with my guards freely, pleasantly, and firmly, as if I had it to command. But really, who am I? I have also been told that I suffer the days of misfortune and serenity with serenity and smiles and pride as someone accustomed to victory. Am I really what these people say about me, or am I only what I know about myself? I am restless. I'm yearning. I'm sick. I'm depressed, like a bird in a cage, struggling for the breath of life, as though someone were choking my throat, hungering for colors and flowers and the songs of birds, thirsting for kind words, human closeness, shaking with anger at capricious tyranny and the pettiest of slurs, bedeviled by anxiety, awaiting great events that might never occur, fearfully powerless and worried for all my friends far away, and weary and empty in prayer, in thinking, in doing, weak and ready to take leave of it all. Who am I? This man or the other? Am I then the man today, one man today and another tomorrow? Am I both at once? An imposter to others, but to me little more than a whining, despicable weakling. Does what is in me compare to a vanquished army that flees in disorder before the battle is already won? Who am I? They mock me, these lonely questions of mine. Whoever I am, I know, O God, you know I am yours. This is the actual poem as it was written. So, Bonhoeffer, quite a life. We decided to focus more on his life rather than his teachings, because his life is an embodiment of his teachings. If you know the man, you know his teachings, and you know who he is. Terry, how much time have I got? Am I done? Terry, by the way, Terry set this all up, so thank Terry for all that. Really appreciate that.
To exit, don't walk across the starting. Just go up the north aisle and around.
And if you're late, I'll give you an absolution.
Now, this came from the adult faith formation team. I would challenge you all to fast forward all of that information to 2024. What are you going to do with that information now? And Pastor Joe did something at the beginning. I can't remember who he was talking about, but he said the church is out of touch. Is the church today out of touch? I don't know. That's for you to be thinking about. And I don't want to get this political, but I'm going to say it, is that we do have presidential election coming up in a few months. There are times when it sounds like history. So, with that, I'm going to thank you all for being here. Patience. Please say a prayer for Julie. Thank you.
Thank you all. I'll stay around for questions if you want to have some conversation.